paper, it would take 21 minutes. So I'm going to present the paper to you. Hand-wringing over the younger generation is not a new experience. What's different in the 21st century is that we fret over the future. As we fret over the future of our society, is the data. We're no longer dependent on anecdotal evidence and hunches to surmise that things are moving in a downward spiral. We can measure the changes, and the evidence points heavily toward the reality of an extended regressive period in American society, beginning sometime in the 1960s and continuing well into the first decade of this century. Congregational leaders during such times occupy a place of unique influence in the social system. There are more than 53 million Americans on any given weekend who are in houses of worship. 331,000 houses of worship in the United States, to be specific, and they are led by a number of clergy that cannot be estimated. And so the potential influence of this portion of our society is really formidable. E.O. Wilson, recognizing the potential influence in his book Creation, identifies religion and science as, quote, the two most powerful forces in the world today, including especially the United States. Most congregational leaders who would prefer to be part of the solution to the regression often yield to pressure to focus on the symptoms and the issues of the regression, and inadvertently, I think, then contribute to the level of anxiety rather than reducing it. Religious leaders are subject to the same kinds of fears and anxieties as others in the culture. It's unsurprising then that the clergy often join the ranks of the reactive, focusing their rhetoric and their leadership and their political involvement on a few emotionally laden social and political issues such as abortion or homosexuality. The use of the language culture war that's become popular since Pat Buchanan introduced that at the Republican Convention in 1992 further polarizes viewpoints on issues like these and defines those who think differently as enemies. Religion is often co-opted by the polarized representatives of partisan politics. Reactive religious leaders hastily join the parade led by political figures, right or left, and support an agenda of knee-jerk, quick-fix, ineffective legislative solutions focused on society's symptoms. Congregants have their own fears and anxieties reinforced or further stirred as a result, and the regressive societal behaviors continue unabated. The very institutions, including churches, that could be contributing to the progress of society instead contribute to its regression during periods of such cultural distortion. Anxious times require a new way of thinking. Among leaders that can move beyond a focus on symptoms and issues, allowing clergy to lead their congregations and their communities in a more functional direction. Insights from Bowen Family Systems Theory, I think, is one of those sources that can offer clergy a sustainable way forward in the face of crisis and chaos. Bowen Systems Theory has informed practitioners in a wide variety of fields, from family therapy to medicine to organizational life to education and business. If the realm of human relationships is the territory through which one is traveling, Bowen Theory is the map that allows one an opportunity to negotiate that territory more thoughtfully and wisely. In the face of societal regression, where rising anxiety has its impact on the congregation and its life, the families within the congregation, and the clergy as well, Bowen Theory offers a different way of seeing the problems, of seeing one's part in them, and of choosing new ways of responding. Given the challenges of the current regression and the unique position occupied by clergy in this culture, America's congregational leaders have an opportunity to influence their own systems toward better emotional functioning and progress. Higher functioning congregations, clear on their own mission and purpose, vitally connected to their own communities, can extend this progress outward as the ripple effect moves beyond the congregation to families, schools, civic organizations, businesses, corporations, and even perhaps the legal system. But this will require a way of thinking about leadership and about that regression that moves beyond decrying the symptoms and blaming others to taking responsibility for the mission of the congregation and one's own life as a leader. Clergy have a claim to a legacy, I think, that has been left them by the Hebrew prophets who, during times of societal regression, called their people back to the principles of the covenant that bound them to their God. Few of those spokesmen, the prophets, received a hearing from the political and religious leaders of their day, who are offering quick fix advice. As Jeremiah the prophet put it, these so-called leaders have healed the brokenness of my people superficially, saying, peace, peace, but there is no peace. This kind of prophetic posture is not merely railing against the sins of the day, but it is holding up the principles of what is right and whole and healthy by both life and word. Led by principled men and women, faith communities that can model a principled way of holding, and a principled way, hold the possibility of influencing their immediate environment and creating ripples that can spread through the broader context. What is it that must characterize such leaders and communities? The list is probably quite long. I'm going to underscore simply 3 points of focus that I think are tied especially to my understanding of Bowen theory. The first of those principles is a focus on self rather than a focus on the symptoms of society or the failures of others. Effective leadership at such time will be carried out by women and men who work on the capacity to focus on their own lives, their own thinking, their own roles and responsibility, their own part to play, the log in their own eye, rather than upon the failures of others. They will be leaders who learn to manage their own reactivity to the anxiety of society. I love that picture. I don't know if you can see it. It's dark enough. Those are birds in front of the cabin. Self-management is indispensable for the leader in anxious settings. Murray Bowen describes such leadership in An Odyssey Towards Science, his epilogue to Michael Kerr's book, Family Evaluation. Bowen described a family leader as one, quote, with the courage to define self, who is as invested in the welfare of the family as in self, who is neither angry nor dogmatic, whose energy goes into changing self rather than telling others what they should do, who can know and respect the multiple opinions of others, and who can modify self in response to the strengths of the group, and who is not influenced by the irresponsible opinions of others. This describes the kind of high-functioning leadership that might offer help to congregations and communities in such times. Regression is stemmed in a family when one family member finally has enough and rises up out of the mess with an I position, saying in one way or another, I believe this family can do better. Enunciating clearly and calmly what one will and will not do, and holding that position in the face of the pressure to return to the previous togetherness of the group, eventually results in the rest of the family functioning at a higher level. Bowen's 8th concept states that the same process would operate in a society. As one leader after another has the courage to function differently, out of differentiation of self, bit by bit, portions of society stand a chance of functioning at a higher level. A better differentiated leader working from the perspective offered by thinking systems will focus on self, on one's part in the situation, on his or her own responsibilities, on the mission or purpose of the organization, and on understanding better the anxieties that underlie the presenting problems or symptoms. In this way, Bowen family systems theory informs the kind of leadership called for on part of the clergy, especially during times of regression. The second principle or idea that's part of this for me is that it is a focus on principles rather than symptoms that is called for. The common reactive tendency of both families and the larger society is to get drawn into a focus on symptoms. That focus is not helpful, however. Friedman noted that when families get fixed on their symptoms rather than on emotional processes, they simply recycle the problems, no matter how much expert advice they receive. The same behaviors that characterize an anxious family abound in a chronically anxious society, including heightened reactivity, increased hurting, blame displacement, quick fix mentality, and a failure of nerve and leadership. These traits subvert the evolutionary processes of human beings and drag society downward. Leadership in such times requires a different focus, away from the symptoms to oneself. Friedman calls for leaders who have the capacity to separate themselves from the surrounding emotional process, the capacity to be clear about their own principles and vision, the willingness to take risks, the persistence to face inertial resistance, and the self-regulation to stand in the face of reactive sabotage. These capacities are found in high-functioning, well-differentiated leaders. One vital aspect of differentiation of self is becoming clear about one's own beliefs, values, and principles. What are those beliefs we hold that we are not willing to negotiate under pressure from those around us? What are the things we both profess and consistently attempt to live? For most, beliefs have been absorbed or imposed but not clearly thought out. Leaders during times of regression especially will need to be clear about their most important principles and will need to live by them even under pressure to compromise. Bowen noted that a high percentage of people trying to define a self will reach out to some set of social norms, such as the Ten Commandments, to, quote, state their beliefs. He said they don't believe what they believe. They believe what they're told they must believe. A well-differentiated leader operates more often on the basis of thought-out principles, beliefs, and values. These core beliefs provide the basis for their decision-making rather than emotional reactions to the anxiety of the group demanding a quick fix or the pressures for togetherness. Congregational leaders come to their task with principles and beliefs that include their own understanding and commitment to various theological and ethical concepts in their tradition. To the degree that these concepts have been personally and thoughtfully appropriated, they provide a means of calling the congregation to consider its own mission, purpose, and values. Otherwise, I think invoking them is as likely to be another emotional reaction to the anxiety of the moment. As congregational leaders, clergy cannot afford to set aside core theological, ethical beliefs as we attempt to provide wise leadership in these interesting times. Clergy who remain connected to their congregation, who think through their own beliefs, seek to live principled lives, and who encourage and coach others in that process as well, can create ripples of maturity that are capable of spreading through the congregation and surrounding community. Clearly, many theological and ethical categories will be helpful to the thoughtful leader and to congregations that take responsibility for changing their part in the anxiety and regression of their own communities by defining their purpose, thinking through their beliefs, and living into them with increasing integrity. The third implication for me of what I read in Bowen's work about societal emotional process, and that has to do with the anxiety that he believed drove that regression. Bowen analyzed the current regression and pointed primarily to environmental sources in the underlying anxiety of the times. The anxiety that drives the regression, he believed, was not generated by the conflict between human beings, such as war. Rather, the conflict between humans and creation lies at the root of the regression. He surmised, based partly on the work of John B. Calhoun, that an exploding human population with its attendant environmental impact was near the source of the problem. Human beings are instinctively aware that the resources needed to sustain life on Earth are limited, and that the rapidly increasing population may soon exhaust such things as arable land, clean water, and petroleum. At the same time, human beings notice the absence of new frontiers in which to spread, begin to feel more fenced in. Additionally, we begin to recognize that the waste products of our unsustainable, consumer-driven lifestyle will not be able to be absorbed by our ecosystem much longer. The constant threats to the planet through elimination of large portions of rainforest, extinction of hundreds of species, the spewing of nitrogen-based agricultural products into our waters, and the atmospheric effects of carbon-based lifestyles of the developed nations are ignored by many. Denial of the threat at the conscious level does not fool the emotional system, however. The threat to our environment is perceived as a threat to our future and survival, and anxiety rises. Bowen suggested that pulling out of the regression would require, quote, a human being who can live in better harmony with nature. What efforts on the part of leaders might move in that direction? How might high-functioning congregational leaders respond to this underlying source of societal anxiety? I run the risk of being taken prescriptively by offering my thinking and suggestions about possible directions to be taken. My caveat is that these are not quick fixes either. These are simply directions that are counter to the one currently pursued by our culture and ones that I'm attempting to build into my own living. These actions must be preceded by thinking, by conviction, by beliefs, and by principles. They need to be incorporated into the lives of leaders, not merely advocated in words. E.O. Wilson, entomologist, biologist, self-designated secular humanist, and author, wrote a book entitled, ironically, The Creation. As a literary device, he addresses the book as if it were an impassioned letter to an unnamed recipient who is a Southern Baptist pastor. The pastor is assumed to be reasonable, devout, and committed to his beliefs. Wilson attempts to persuade this pastor that both the writer and the pastor have a reason to hold a common goal, saving life on the earth. Wilson apparently hopes to engage the leadership of conservative evangelical Protestants in the effort to live in greater harmony with the creation. He tells his imaginary reader, quote, you are well prepared to present the theological and moral arguments to save the creation. I am heartened by the movement growing within the Christian denomination to support global conservation. The stream of thought has arisen from many sources, from evangelical to Unitarian. Today it is but a rivulet, tomorrow it will be a flood. Responsible religious leaders who accept the environmental analysis of our regression as accurate will employ their role as teacher, preacher to educate congregants regarding the issues of stewardship of the earth. They will think through their own ecology and apply biblical teachings to the current issues. Genesis 1:26 through 30 and 2:15, for example, are suggestive of the human responsibility to, quote, cultivate and tend the garden in which we've been placed. Genesis 3 narrates the separation between humanity and the creation that is a consequence of humans turning away from God. Many of the agricultural instructions of the Mosaic Law imply responsibility to care for the land. In fact, the concept of the land itself as a gift of God to Israel is a central theme in Hebrew Scriptures. American congregations can learn to appreciate anew the holiness of creation from a biblical perspective. Wendell Berry writes of the way in which an honest reading of Scripture points to a view of the earth that confesses God's ownership of it all, our responsibilities and stewardship of it, and the holiness of creation and all life on it. Berry notes the disconnectedness or disharmony between human beings and creation. This shows up, not least of all, in our disconnectedness from the soil, the supply of our life. Berry describes what he called the industrial eater as one who does not know that eating is an agricultural act, who no longer knows or imagines the connections between eating and the land, and who is therefore necessarily passive and uncritical, in short, a victim. When food in the minds of eaters is no longer connected with farming and with the land, then the eaters are suffering a kind of cultural amnesia that is misleading and dangerous. As an antidote to this disconnection, Berry, a way of living in greater harmony with creation, Berry urges a kind of urban agrarianism in which one acts more deliberately and consciously in regard to food. Bridging the disconnection between the human and the creation might begin with being more mindful about what we do thoughtlessly 3 times a day when we sit down to eat. Reconnecting with the creation may be particularly challenging for those who live in urban and suburban settings. It's the very place where the disconnection is experienced most powerfully, however. As the human population has exploded, so have the extraordinarily large cities around the globe. In 1900, only 14% of the population lived in cities. Today, half the people in the world do, half of 7 billion people. By 2050, 70% of a 9 to 12 billion population will be dwelling in cities. It's easy to imagine how nature or creation becomes a near mythological concept to people whose daily life is filled with concrete, glass, and asphalt. Yet the need to reconnect harmoniously with the creation is more dire in these very settings. Many of the symptoms of the regression, crowding, violence, drug abuse, crime, family distress, pollution, are especially prominent in the cities. One might assume that this disconnect with creation would generate even higher levels of chronic social anxiety in urban contexts. Consequently, the urban and suburban environments might be all the more in need of connection with the soil. In a presentation on societal regression in 2009 in El Paso, Dan Papero noted that in the midst of regression, signs of progress may also be found. One encouraging trend in this decade involves a movement, especially among younger urban and suburban adults, to eat slow. That stands for seasonal, local, organic, and whole. Locally grown produce sold at small and large urban farmers markets and CSAs appear in more and more cities. Schools, churches, hospitals, community associations in cities and towns are developing community gardens. Organic production is on the increase because of consumer demand. Sustainable agricultural processes are being reclaimed, especially on the multitude of small farms across the country. The writings of Wendell Berry, Jane Goodall, Barbara Kinsolver, Michael Pollan, Joel Salatin, and others have helped to place an alternative way of thinking about food before an urban and suburban audience. These and other signs of greater environmental responsibility are cropping up in media and in practice and are marks of some progress. Leaders are rising out of the morass of the regression to offer an alternative way to relate to creation more harmoniously. How might commitments to principles of simplicity reshape the way clergy and congregants live in a world where disconnection between the human and earth results in an irresponsibly consumptive lifestyle? The classic spiritual disciplines of prayer, worship, solitude, and simplicity provide resources for living in greater harmony with the created order. Other responsible ways of living involve using less energy, taking up less land for waste disposal, being frugal with scarce resources such as water, and recycling recyclable materials can serve to bring our lives into greater harmony with creation. Additionally, building recreation into our lives that puts us in contact with the creation ought to be considered as a thoughtful response. Clean parks available in urban inner city areas might be the nearest some people ever come to being out in nature. Congregations may find ways of helping make this connection possible. The question is, what can clergy contribute out of our own thoughtful beliefs and convictions, by our own life and example, by our preaching and teaching, and by our leadership to help us reconnect congregations with the creation in a life lived in greater harmony with it? Whatever we can do might well have an impact not only on the earth and other life forms with which we share, but also on the level of anxiety in our communities, in our culture, as more and more people in our congregations reconnect responsibly with creation. The current regression did not arise quickly, and I skipped over a whole bunch of things that we could have talked about, but I wasn't planning to. So, okay. Did not arise quickly. It developed over decades as anxiety increased, as reactivity heightened, as symptoms appeared, as society reacted to those symptoms with wars on drugs, and wars on poverty, and wars on terrorism, with denial, with superficial agendas, with loud rhetoric, with knee-jerk legislation, and with a failure of nerve to stand for what is needed. We abandoned our principles to silence the demands of the least mature for their rights. Over the years, we elected leaders who promised to fix what is wrong. When they did not or could not, we ousted them for others who promised they would take care of it. We demanded our rights and forsook our responsibilities. We acted out of appetites and instincts rather than out of reason. We exploited the resources of the earth and exploded in numbers. Congregations and their leaders and members were often part of this same soup. All of this took time. The current regression will not end quickly. That does not relieve congregational leaders from the task of responsible influence. Focusing on differentiation, becoming the best version of ourselves emotionally and spiritually as we can, is not optional for leaders during such times. Clarifying and developing our thinking and our core principles, beliefs, and values is necessary, for we will be asked to enunciate those, to take stand on those, and to live consistently in light of them. Asking and answering key theological and ethical questions with our congregations will be part of the process. And if you accept the environmental thesis of Bowen and others as the best explanation of the source of the societal anxiety underlying this regression, then we will learn to connect with creation more responsibly as stewards living in greater harmony with the created order as leaders in its congregations. And we have 5 minutes.
Just one quick question. Where can we get a copy of your paper?
Email me, I email you. All right. We were talking about this at Victoria's house at a seminar in the spring. I was working on a version of this, and one of the frustrating things to me about this is this sounds simplistic still to my ears. Be careful how you recycle, but things have to start somewhere, and I do believe that influence spreads in ripples like that, and so there are places to begin.
As I was listening to your presentations,
You may need to turn that on.
turn that on.
Turn it on. It may be.
There's a switch.
There's a switch. It may need to be turned on.
It's on. I just can't hear it. As I was listening to your presentation, I was just thinking about a book that's coming out. I apologize, I cannot remember the name of it, but if anyone's interested, I can get access to it. But basically, it was talking about how the impact of the immediacy of access to information via the internet, which has been a huge game changer, I think, in terms of our society, how that's led to increased reactivity literally across the world. And one example that comes to mind for me was when a religious figure was depicted in a cartoon in a not very flattering way, and within hours there was rioting and deaths as a result of a reaction to that. And one of some of the research that's been done has been around the idea that when, as human beings, we have access to such immediate information, it leads to impulsiveness and to impulsive decisions. And so I was thinking about that in the context of how challenging it is to be a leader in a society in which, in a very few short years, what used to take at least hours or days for information to get processed and responded to, now literally with the click of a button, I can make a decision to donate to something that I saw as I was surfing the net, or to write to my congressman about something that I don't even know a whole lot about, but when my friend said, hey, look, you need to talk about this so that this legislation doesn't get passed. So I was just curious about what your thought was around the impact of that on a lot of the things that...
Part of it, yeah, I think, for me, it's as if somewhere in the 90s, I don't think Bowen could have seen this coming the way that it did, but it's as if the whole globe got a central nervous system installed, so that you're right, it's not even seconds, it's just almost immediate reactivity is possible. Congregations find this to be, email and congregations are not good combinations. Things used to take much longer to get through that system too, but they happen pretty quickly now. But you're right, it makes reactivity more immediate. And so yeah, I think that's a part of, it's a neutral tool, but given a reactive and regressive society, it becomes, I think it just spirals faster than that. Thanks.
Thank you.
You can tell any one of these presentations could be the afternoon program. So I appreciate each and all cramming it into 30 minutes, and look forward to the panel for discussion of the ideas stirred. It'll be Dr. Katie Long, not Katie Lang, but Katie Long.
Is this working? This topic from two different directions. One is that I work with a lot of people in the ordination process who are aspiring to be leaders within congregations. And I also have a hobby of reading presidential biographies. So I'm very interested in leaders from a couple of different directions. And most of the time when we look at leaders and leadership, it's with an individual view. We look at the leader, whether it's a president or a city councilman or whoever, we look at them as people who may be exceptional in their families. Or if their success is really singular and there are a lot of failures in the family, we often say the person overcame their family. And even in systems settings, I find that when someone is a leader, we tend to look for signs of differentiation, and when they aren't, we look at all those other folks. A systems approach, I like this quote from Bowen, that a family is a giant jigsaw puzzle of strength and weakness, with each family member holding parts of the puzzle. So a systems approach to this would look not at a collection of individuals, but how emotional fusion and processes within the family, borrowing and lending of self-projection, how those things play parts in a leader's emergence. And it might even inquire whether the principles that the leader espouses belong to that person or to the family. Today, I'm going to be presenting about the Roosevelt family. And the reason I choose them is that within 2 generations, they produced 3 world-class leaders, Theodore, Eleanor, and Franklin. I will not deal as much with Franklin as I would like to. That's almost another presentation, but he'll figure it. I should put a disclaimer on here which says that even though the Roosevelt's lives are well documented, we can't reconstruct with absolute certainty how the emotional process worked. Nonetheless, there's some patterns here that I think are suggestive. Theodore's father was also named Theodore. He was called Thee. And he was, man, that runs a long. Okay, he was the youngest surviving son of Cornelius Van Schaack Roosevelt, who made the first million in that branch of the Roosevelt family, and Martha Barnhill, who introduced the ideal of noblesse oblige. People with privilege have responsibilities to the society around them. That figures importantly over generations. Robert was a ladies' man, somewhat colorful, lots of scrapes. The one the family had to explain to people is the way one biographer put it. So he got a lot of nervous focus because the family was pretty staid overall. Stay there. These first 3, Weir, who was ensuring, James Alfred, and Cornelius, the last 2 being active in the family business, took care of all the financial issues for the family. They did it, in fact, over 3 generations. They simply took care of the financial functioning. So Thee, who was a junior partner, youngest brother, was pretty free to pursue whatever it was he wanted to. He was acknowledged by his mother as her favorite, and he acknowledged his devotion to her. So he energetically took on his mother's ideal of bettering society, and he bettered it all up. Children's Aid Society, New York Orthopedic Dispensary and Hospital, Metropolitan Museum of Art, American Museum of Natural History, founder of all those. And others, okay, lots of others. Now, he married Martha Bullock. And I'm going to have to read this one because her family was not quite as well organized as the Roosevelts. After losing her first husband, Minnie's mother, that's the one that the arrow points to over here, Martha Stewart, had married that husband's son-in-law by his previous marriage. Don't even try. It produced an interesting collection of siblings and step-relatives. And in contrast to the Roosevelts, these family members tended to be sea captains and military heroes, more colorful than the Roosevelts. So their marriage appears to have been a passionate love marriage, but it was simply not without tension, and particularly during the Civil War. Their firstborn, Bammy, suffered from Pott's disease, which is a painful and deforming form of tuberculosis that settles in the spine. And people have theorized that Thee's anguish at her pain led to a mutually adoring relationship, and one biographer put it this way: in a family notable for its intense attachments, theirs was perhaps the most intense of all. Minnie was distant in a triangle with them. In fact, there is no record in any of her correspondence of any expression of concern about her daughter's symptoms. Instead, she focused on Mitty as strong and capable, and those were absolutely characteristics that she showed and which her 3 siblings to follow counted on. An example. This is the beginning of Theodore Roosevelt, young at the time, about 11, who is writing a journal as they started a European Grand Tour. When I put we 3, I mean Ellie, Coney, and I. Elliot, Coney, and Theodore, brothers and sisters. When I put big people, I mean Papa, Mama, and Daddy. So the younger children really counted her in with the adults, and that recurs. Minnie had depression, digestive episodes, and headaches. Thea worried over her health. He writes, I have always been accustomed to think of you as one of my little babies. Now, owing to financial difficulties, the household increased in 1856. Minnie's mother, and they were the ones with financial difficulties, Minnie's mother and sister moved in with them when they had to abandon their house in the South. And they were of great help to her in child rearing and just general emotional support. Anna, the sister, was the tutor, the person who did the education for the Roosevelt children for years. They were homeschooled. So, Minnie has a good bit of support around her from the South. And then in the Civil War, and by now, by this time, of course, there are 4 Roosevelt children, or they are added, 1860, 1861. And Thea is away conducting a program of sending home allotments of military salaries of Union soldiers to their homes to provide for the families. And while he was away, Mitty, her mother, and sister were discreetly packaging up supplies to send south. There was a bit of tension in the house. Mitty's mother, also Theodore's, but speaking of Mitty here, her mother died in 1864. 2 years later, her sister married and moved out of the house. And of the 13 assorted siblings and step-siblings, only 4 survived the Civil War. 2 of them fled to England to avoid prosecution. So there are a number of people who think of this loss of support within the household and the extended family as the beginning of a gradual decline in her functioning. Accounts vary a bit about whether Theodore's asthma began very early or when he was a toddler. But in any case, it worsened substantially in 1862 while his father was away for months on end with his mission to the Confederate soldiers. So both families from that point focused very anxiously on Theodore. Walk the floor, sit up with him at night, keep their bags packed to go and change the air. Now, there are a number of accounts that suggest that Theodore overcame his asthma by living vigorously, and he made efforts at this that are flatly extreme. But his asthma cleared, or nearly so. His situation improved dramatically. All of his medical symptoms, his health became robust when he left home for home. And the asthma recurred in his life, but never as severely. Coney and Elliot also had asthma. Coney had some other symptoms besides that. Alone in this whole wave of shifting symptoms, and their correspondence, you can watch the symptoms shift around amongst the family. Thea alone has 0 symptoms. And he writes home unable to imagine how he, this robust person, could possibly have a family of sickly people. This suggests, in Bowen's terminology, borrowing and lending and giving and sharing of self within the family. In the summer of 1874, things shifted. Eliot had been taller and healthier and more successful at everything, but during this period of time when Theodore surpassed him academically, and that's the main coincidental event one can find, Eliot began having spells, and they're never spelled out exactly what it was within the correspondence, but they seem to have been some type of emotional breakdown that frightened the family terribly. So Thea decided not to send Eliot to college, and he began strongly encouraging Theodore to treat Eliot as a junior, as a younger brother. So a pattern begins here of greatly increased functioning on Theodore's part and much lower functioning on Eliot's part, a progressive pattern. Then, let's go back here. Years of philanthropy. Theodore was a leader in New York, a recognized leader in New York in philanthropy. He was then put up for the political post of commissioner of the New York court as part of a reform movement. In that, he was rejected. He suffered a very public humiliation. It was probably the first time he'd ever been humiliated in his life. He had abdominal pains during the hearings, and then he died less than 2 months later, swift course of stomach cancer. His death rocked the family, which had fairly well organized itself around him. And Eliot, in whose arms he died, said never to have recovered from it. After Thea's death, Bammy's absolute devotion to him shifted to Theodore, as did the support of mother and other sister. And Eliot's functioning continued to go down. Bowen says this: in a state of disequilibrium, the family system operates automatically to restore the former togetherness equilibrium, though this be at the expense of some. 1880. Theodore married Alice Lee Hathaway, an absolute passionate love match, and at one of their engagement parties, a friend of Bammy, his older sister, named Sarah Delano, met James Roosevelt, who was a widower. And they got married before Theodore and Alice did, because, hey, he was kind of getting old, and so no need to waste time here. And then Eliot took a tour. He left on a ship with James and Sarah to go to England on his way to India for a grand tour. When he returned from that tour, he was asked to be godfather to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Anybody who thinks these families were not well-connected branches of a family neglects a lot of factual information. In any case, Eliot was on his tour. Accounts vary as to how much he drank and on what days. But it was basically playtime. It was basically recreation and sport. While he was away, Theodore was elected to the New York State Assembly and wrote a well-received naval history of the War of 1812 in 16 months. So Theodore is moving forward in a political career, in part empowered by that same financial management by the uncles who supported his fall. This is a quote from him that I think bespeaks some effort for differentiation of self and some acknowledgement I tried faithfully to do what Father had done, but I did it poorly. In the end, I found out that we have each in his own way to do our best, and when I struck mine, though it differed from his, yet I was able to follow the same lines and do what he would have had me do. Upon his return, Elliot, on the other hand, moved in with his mother, who he was observing was getting somewhat uneven, very eccentric. He slept off the alcove of her bedroom, and he knows this. Now when my little mother feels cold at night, she comes in and puts an extra blanket on me, so that I wake up perfectly roasted, and when she is warm, she comes in and takes the covers off me, so that I wake up frozen. Friends and family hoped that his marriage in 1883 to Anna Hall would give him focus and stability. It didn't. His wife was really the only focus of his life. Moving along as quickly as I can here, in 1884 there are 3 notable events. Pregnant Alice had moved in with Minnie while Theodore was in legislative session. She gave birth to Alice Lee. 2 days later, Alice Lee died of an undiagnosed kidney difficulty, and Minnie died of typhus. Same house, same day, double funeral. And 9 months later, Eleanor Roosevelt is born to Elliot and his wife. During this same period of time, watch what Bambi does. Theodore leaves her with all his condolence correspondence, the building of a home he had started on Oyster Bay, and care of baby Alice for 3 years. And, by the way, she attended the birth of Eleanor Roosevelt. She was an incredible source of support for those 2 nieces. She would talk to them about their mothers. For Eleanor, she was a total source of encouragement. The book has yet to be written on this one. Theodore came back, declining to talk about his wife, and remarried 2 years later, had 5 children. And with this marriage, Theodore again had 3 women supporting his career. Bambi was already trying to get him re-involved in politics. Coney had married someone that the family liked more than she did, really. And Bambi didn't marry till she was 40. But neither sister's husband displaced Theodore as number 1. Elliot's life continued a downward spiral, adding heavy morphine use to heavy drinking. He was in and out of the family and treatment facilities. By this point, the family is doing fixed states. His son and wife died before he did. Tragic. In 1905, Eleanor married her 5th cousin Franklin, her father's godson, who was a close friend of his wife as well. Again, the families are quite connected. Of Franklin, he was the focus of both of his parents. He was their only child. And Doris Kearns Goodwin says, his mother oversaw everything, followed him everywhere. Here was a loving, even adoring autocracy, and an autocracy nonetheless, in which the boy's natural longing for a bit of privacy was felt by his mother to be a deliberate shunning of her company. Until his heart attack, when Franklin was 8, James routinely spent hours in outdoor activities with him. After his father became a virtual invalid, Franklin strove not to upset his father for fear that his heart condition would worsen. And when James died, Sarah moved to Boston to be near her son. So Franklin emerged into adulthood, avoiding confrontation, and with great skill at calming people down. The Franklin, Sarah, Eleanor triangle was predictably intense. Nonetheless, Franklin had an affair, which most people know about. Sarah kept the marriage together by insisting she would disinherit him. if he got a divorce. And then Franklin had polio. And Eleanor, now both these women, huge support for him. When he became paralyzed in 1921, his mother urged him to return to his childhood home to live a quiet life. Eleanor, quote from her, made a stand, successfully encouraging him to return to politics. By putting decreased energy into the marriage itself from the time of the affair onward, she also increasingly pursued significant causes of her own, echoing her family's tradition of noblesse oblige. Let me close this way. It is hard to imagine that Franklin Roosevelt would have been able to raise the American public's support for the unprecedented change of the New Deal, or the arms production and military and civilian mobilization needed to win World War II without Eleanor's strong presence and activity. Eleanor would have had a much smaller platform to launch her own initiatives without him. Franklin would not have been the person he was without his parents. Certainly, Eleanor's own life and that of Theodore Roosevelt would not have been the same without the family's supporting actors. His uncles who managed the family finances, the grandmother and aunt who nurtured him and supported his mother, Bammy, who devoted so much of her life to Theodore's career, to his daughter, and to Eleanor, or his mother and sister, who were devoted to him. Nor would Theodore or Eleanor have had the same lives without the tragic life of Elliott Roosevelt. It is hard to imagine that Theodore could have emerged to the greatness he did had he absorbed the anxiety that came to focus on Elliott. And further, even this, would Theodore's father have been able to pursue his own path to leadership, which paved the way for all the others, had it not been for the family's focus on his brother Robert? These leaders did not emerge in spite of their families, but in the context of them.
Please take about 5 minutes, stretch your legs, and